honestly, this is going to be the best session of the conference. Right? We have so many things to showcase. Like, we're extremely excited to showcase some of the stuff, some of the innovations we've been working on with regards to automation for SharePoint on premises and Office 365 as well. Most of the session is going to be demos, I'm going to be honest. The demos are all going to be available on GitHub. So we're going to put all the code that we've worked on, we're going to make it available on GitHub. We're going to have a link at the end for that. And on that note, let's get started. So one thing I want to do is I just want to get an idea of what audience do we have in the room. So by a show of hands, who here is a dev? A developer. OK, so we have some, even though the session said IT pro. That's good.
Don't be shy.
The rest of you, mostly admins, IT pros? Cool. That's perfect. So I'm a dev, personally. Who's used AutoSPInstaller in the room? Great. You folks all owe Brian a drink. Who's heard of PowerShell desired state configuration, DSC? A few of you. Good. It's perfect. Actually, that's great. Based on your current interests, I want to see who's really more interested in the on-prem model to automate the deployment of SharePoint using on-prem versus Office 365. Show of hand, who's mostly interested in on-prem? Still a few people. OK, the rest, mostly Office 365. OK, that's good. So the agenda of today, what we're going to be doing is I'm going to let Brian give you just an overview of where we're at with AutoSPInstaller, what's happening with the project. The project's been around for forever. We've made some changes. We're going to be talking quickly about what the future looks for AutoSPInstaller. Then I'm going to do a quick overview on PowerShell desired state configuration. I know some of you in the room already are familiar with the tool, but I think it's important for the rest of the audience to understand the basics before we move on to the demos. I'm going to be talking about reverse DSC, which is something that allows you to extract configuration out of an existing environment. We're going to do a demo of that as well. We're going to be doing an introduction to Office 365 DSC, which is a new module we're launching this week that allows you to go and deploy and monitor your Office 365 tenants using PowerShell desired state configuration. And then I'm going to quickly talk a bit about, now that we have our Office 365 configuration as code, how can we integrate that with Azure DevOps or any continuous integration and continuous deployment pipelines that you have within your organization. For those that don't know me, I'm Nick Charlebois, so you can find me on Twitter. Twitter handle is up there. By the way, the deck for this session here is going to be available on the website, and it's also going to be put on the GitHub repo. My main focus is on DevOps and automation. I am a PFE, so Premier Field Engineer based out of Gatineau, Quebec. I've been with Microsoft since late 2015. I was an MVP in PowerShell before then. I am the author for a couple of PowerShell development books. I am the creator and owner of Office 365 DSC and Reverse DSC, as well as the co-owner of the SharePoint DSC, the one that's actually aimed for on-premises deployment. And with me, I have my colleague, Brian. If you want to take the clicker button.
Thank you very much. Hey, everybody. Some of you know me. I think I've met some of you before. I am also Premier Field Engineer based out of Toronto, Canada, specializing in historically mostly SharePoint on-prem, automation, obviously PowerShell, and also infrastructure, best practices, tuning, performance, that kind of thing. So yeah, my big claim to fame, I suppose, is I'm also creator of AutoSPInstaller, subject of a really bad profile pic that I had to scramble at the last minute to get. A co-creator of a web-based approach for building the AutoSPInstaller configurations, the XML configurations, and that can be found at AutoSPInstaller.com. I have a blog, which I'll actually be referencing in this session at blog.lalancette.ca. Although I don't use it, and I don't update it quite nearly as much as I should. I'm also responsible for some other open source SharePoint and PowerShell related projects, AutoSP Source Builder, a relatively new one called AutoSP Updater for patching, a very new one called MS Cloud Login Assistant, which is actually used behind the scenes for SharePoint DSC. later on, and also some contributions to Office 365 DSC, namely that MS Cloud Login Assistant. I'm also responsible for a whole bunch of children as well. You can see I went from 1 to 2 to 4, so there's some twins in that mix too. So the fact that I'm here out of the country is a little bit of a miracle. So let's get right into it. So I'm not going to spend too much time here, and really, to expand a little bit on what Nick said, the main focus of this session is really about the cool, new, fancy DSC-based way of doing things. But I think it's important to point out a little bit of the history, a little bit of where AutoSPInstaller is currently, and what it can still be used for, and where it can still be useful. Because I mean, I like to think that folks have moved on, but as I see in the community, a lot of folks are still using it. And I just want to, later on in a few slides, I'll show an example of how you can still leverage AutoSPInstaller on an existing SharePoint farm. So speaking of which, I'm going to kick off a demo right now, just because it takes about 10 minutes to run. So I'm going to kick it off right now and just show an example of what I was just speaking about. So here I have a farm, just a single server farm in Azure. Azure IaaS. I built this a few days ago, and I was like, okay, I'm pretty happy with it. Oh, wait a second, I forgot to deploy a search service application. And I may have built this with DSC, I may have built this with AutoSPInstaller, I may have built this by hand. The idea is that it's missing a certain configuration piece to this farm, and I want to leverage a scripted approach, not to sort of apply configuration to the entire farm at once, because maybe the farm has shifted since then. Maybe it's, so I've done some manual things and I don't want to pave over what I've done. I just want to apply a specific single configuration to this farm. So very quickly, I'm going to kick off the demo. These steps, by the way, are explained in detail on a blog post that I'm going to refer in a couple of slides. But right now, for the sake of efficiency, I'm going to simply copy and paste this into a SharePoint PowerShell window. So basically 3 steps. I'm importing the module, AutoSPInstaller. I'm creating a variable with an XML type that I'm going to be referencing later on, and then I'm going to call a function, a specific function within AutoSPInstaller. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. As you'll see, I'm a fan of verbose output because I like to see what's actually going on. So in the meantime, this is going to go ahead and start configuring and creating that service application. And we'll check back in about 10 minutes to see how that's doing. So where's AutoSPInstaller at right now? I like to tell folks that it's essentially in maintenance mode. I'm not making a lot of changes to it. I'm not adding new functionality to it. There's been requests to do so, but really my focus is on the new cool way of doing things, the DSC-based approach. In fact, I'm a global lead inside of Microsoft for what we call the managed IP, which leverages SharePoint DSC to build farms. So based on my experience with scripted SharePoint installations, I've sort of been kind of picked on as to be the lead for that. So that's really where my focus is these days. But having said that, I recently added support for SharePoint 2019 to it because it only made sense, and also because it was, I don't know if anyone has worked a lot with SharePoint 2019 versus 2016 versus 2013, but it seems that with every new version, there, at least as far as the plumbing goes, and as the PowerShell stuff and the installation stuff and the service applications, there seem to be less and less changes. So every time a new version of SharePoint comes out, I go, oh no, what am I going to do? Where am I going to find the time to incorporate the new version? And I realize it only takes me a couple days, and I've added 2019 support. So I went ahead and did that. And so it fully supports SharePoint 2019. The min-roll support is a little bit half-baked, but if you know what you're doing, you can get around it and get yourself a nice farm built there. It's important to point out that there's still a little bit of a feature gap between AutoSPInstaller and SharePoint DSC. In some cases, SharePoint DSC does stuff that AutoSPInstaller doesn't. In other cases, if you want to fully automate things like assigning temporary self-signed certificates to web applications, or creating local host entries so that for your web applications, or adding your web applications to the local intranet zone in Internet Explorer. Unless you want to go and write something custom with SharePoint DSC, which you're completely welcome and able to do, AutoSPInstaller still does that stuff kind of out of the box, and it's just a matter of changing a flag from false to true. Having said that, it can still be the fastest way to get yourself a farm built. And I say that only because a lot of people are familiar with it. There's not a lot of learning curve to get into something with AutoSPInstaller, especially if you've used it before. DSC, although very, very powerful, at least what I've found is that it has a bit of a learning curve to it. So if you want to get yourself a farm built quickly and no fuss, no muss, then SharePoint or AutoSPInstaller can still be a viable route for that. And finally, if anyone has the reason to still build a SharePoint 2010 farm these days, for example, if you're migrating from a customer who has, or maybe your own company still has a MOS 2007 farm, you know that to go from there to any upstream version of SharePoint, you're going to need to go through SharePoint 2010. And if you want to automate that, then your choice between SharePoint DSC and AutoSPInstaller becomes very clear. The only one that supports 2010 is AutoSPInstaller still. And that's because of a number of reasons, namely mostly to do with the version of PowerShell that's supported with SharePoint 2010. So yeah, it's still a viable option. In fact, it's your only option of the two if you're going to install SharePoint 2010. Sorry, I'll just need my glasses. Thank you. And really, like I said, it's essentially maintenance mode. And what I find is happening is, as much as I try to sort of move on with the new stuff, I find myself constantly going back to it, or either to support folks that need help with it, or just an example like I'm using now with a demo that's running in the background, where I want to apply a single piece of functionality to an existing farm. So probably the most significant change in AutoSPInstaller recently has been the conversion of a file called AutoSPInstaller functions.ps1 to a proper PowerShell module. And folks like Todd Klin have been bugging me to do that for years, and then finally I found some time and I actually went ahead and did it. So it wasn't a lot of work, but you'll find that it comes in very, very useful for running individual functions. You can still .source a PS1 file that contains functions and run it from there, but it seems more natural and really a better approach to do it with a proper PowerShell module. And like I said earlier, I actually have a blog post that I have originally posted back in 2014. I just recently updated it to reflect the fact that you can that AutoSPInstaller is now a module. Excuse me. And the commands associated to do it with that approach. The unfortunate thing is, as opposed to working with a lot of modules that you might be comfortable with, because in a lot of cases it'd be like up to 10 parameters to pass at once, we still need to pass an XML input file as a parameter for most of the functions. In fact, when I go back to the demo and I show you the command that I ran to provision search service application, we really just loaded the XML file that we had pre-populated with the information for the search service application, and we passed that as a parameter to the command. And now I'm going to quickly switch back to that demo. Oops, over here, which is still running. So I'm going to check back on the status of that in a moment. But I just wanted to highlight the fact that how I got to this point. I did not have to create a complete XML file from scratch, although the AutoSPInstaller.com would be very, very useful for doing that if I needed to do that. In this case, all I really needed to do was take an existing XML file. And this is neat, by the way. In the new Edge browser, if anyone has had a look at it, the new Edge Dev Preview, you can actually just drag that XML file right onto the file picker button, and it'll just automatically load it. So I click on my search service application. I didn't really bother with any of this other stuff other than maybe the managed accounts. But with the search service application, I simply entered the information I needed to in here. And then went into review and download, grabbed it, and then put it into my XML file, and then in turn passed that XML file into the command and saved it as a variable, which then got passed to the function. And all of that information is being used right now to build my search service application. If it doesn't finish in time, I still want to show you quickly where we're at with that service application. So you notice that this is the previous set of service applications that I had on this farm. No search to be seen. Do a quick refresh of that, and all of a sudden you'll see this AutoSPInstaller search service application being created. And I just named it that just so that you can actually see that there's that it's different than the built-in one. And if I switch over to my SQL Server for this farm, you'll see there's all my databases nicely named that happen to be built with DSC. Do a quick refresh on here, and we should see some new databases in here. Right, so we have my 4 databases for AutoSP. And all of that was just built with, again, I didn't run the entire script. I didn't need to. I just pulled one function out of it, gave it the parameters that it needed, and now we have a search service application well on its way.
Okay, so let's move on to DSC. We're going to come back to this demo later on. So let's, whoa. Wow.
Clicker got excited.
So PowerShell desired state configuration. So it's something that's been around since around 2014, I'd say. It was released with PowerShell 4. You guys are getting all the teasers. Don't look at that, don't look at that. Yes, so PowerShell desired state configuration was released back in 2014 with PowerShell 4. Therefore, it's not supported for SharePoint 2010. SharePoint 2010 runs on PowerShell 2.0, so .NET CLR 3.5. So we don't support it for 2010. However, it works 2013, 2016, 2019, and now Office 365 DSC. This here is a piece of desired state configuration code. Right? So it is somewhat human readable. So what we have here is we actually have a code block that says, I want to define a new web application. Here's the name, here's the app pool, the URL, and the port. So this is what I want. If we put it in comparison with what we have with the imperative approach, which we're all used to, where we say, I want a new web application, and I pass in all the params, it looks similar. Right? The difference is, if I was to go and run this once, and run it again, PowerShell will come back with an error and say there's already an application running on that port. Whereas this here, I can run it as often as I want, and it's always going to bring my web application in that state. And Brian, please, what's the word that I can't pronounce for that? Idempotency?
Idempotency.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. I'm useful.
So you want to take it for that one?
Yeah, sure.
Jesus. All right, let's
forget
forget about the clicker and go back here.
All right, no worries. Let's go back to...
I guess the idea is, if you put the two in comparison, the imperative versus the declarative, the imperative is that example. So take the analogy where you're trying to get a cake for your daughter's birthday, right? The imperative approach would be the list of ingredients, the recipe, if you want. All right, so you need the flour, you need the sugar, you put the flour and sugar together and so on. Whereas the declarative approach, and please use the mouse, the declarative approach is basically, here's what I want. I want it to be chocolate flavored. I want it to look like a unicorn, but I don't care how you do it. That's the end result I want. Right? So that's really the main difference between the two approaches. So PowerShell desired state configuration, if we take a 10,000 feet look at it, basically what it is a way for you to deploy your environments, but also to make sure they stay in that state. That's really important. So it also does the monitoring. Right? So the moment I send my configuration over to the server, that configuration will be applied, and the server will do frequent checks that we call consistency checks to make sure that server is still in the desired state. And the way it does it is using something we called the Local Configuration Manager, LCM. Any machine that runs PowerShell 4.0 or above has that agent installed on it. That is the DSC engine. Every DSC LCM can be configured 3 ways. The first one is apply only. Apply only would be the equivalent of doing sequential scripts. You define what the configuration should be, you send it over to your LCM agent, it will configure the server, and once it's done, that's it, nothing else will happen. It's the equivalent almost of an AutoSPInstaller in a certain way, right? So it doesn't do that consistency check after the fact. The second mode is apply and monitor, and that is the default option that you have the moment you have PowerShell installed. That one will go and bring the server in that desired state, and every 15 minutes, by default, we'll do this consistency check. So if we take the example where I had my web application previously set on port 80, let's say somebody goes in, let's call him Bob. Bob goes in, changes that web application to port 90. Within 15 minutes, my server is going to detect that it's no longer in the desired state, and it will actually log something in the event viewer saying no longer in the desired state because of ABC. That's the second option, and that's the default. The third one, extremely powerful, but also you need to know what you're doing, is apply and autocorrect. So if it detects that there's a configuration drift, it will do anything in its power, everything in its power to bring the server back in that desired state. True story. I had a customer of mine that decided to deploy all their information architecture with DSC. Worked fine. They deployed subwebs, created site collections, and so on. Project was a success, but they set everything to apply and autocorrect. 3 months down the road, they realized that half of their sites were never being used, so they decided to do some spring cleaning. Deleted about 100 sites. Well, within 15 minutes, they were all back, right? And they couldn't figure out what was happening. So that's available, just something to watch out for.
Really quickly, if you think of a good analogy, and again, I'm really big on analogies, what Nick just described is really like PowerShell-based group policy. Right? Anyone who's familiar with Active Directory group policy, you can go in and you can remove someone from the administrators group and think, haha, I fooled the administrators because I'm a local admin myself. Guess what? The next time group policy applies, it's going to add that domain group back into the local administrators. It's very, very similar to that.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And one of the question I always get asked is, what's the difference between the two? My answer to that is simple enough. Is group policies will prevent you from doing something from the get-go somehow. DSC will notify you in most cases, so apply and monitor, but it won't prevent you from doing it from the get-go, right? There'll be like that little delay, but it'll come back and it'll actually tell you, right, you're no longer in that desired state. Okay, so there's a little difference as far as timing goes for this. The other thing I want you to take out of this session is that DSC is not only there to tell your server what needs to be on it, you can also specify what should never be on your server. For example, if we take the example of SharePoint 2013, we don't have min roles. If you have a server that's supposed to be a web front end, you probably don't want to have your search application running on there. So what you can do is you can say something like this here, SP search service instance, WSS search, absent. So if somebody goes in and turns on that service, within 15 minutes, DSC will realize that that service has been turned on and it's going to report the configuration drift or disable the service. Okay, so that's one thing you can do. But it's almost impossible for you to define all the non-scenarios. So but that is something that's available. So let's do a quick demo. So what I want to do is I want to switch to this environment here. So that's a Windows Server 2019 environment running in Azure IaaS. Right now what I have is I have one web application here that if I go and look at the managed path, we can see that I only have one managed path called sites. Okay. I have a DSC configuration here that specifies two managed paths. One called video managed path that is going to be associated with the web application we just looked at. The relative URL is going to be videos. It's not explicit. It doesn't have host headers and so on. And I'm going to create a second one called archives. Now with DSC, the way it works is this here is your code, but that code needs to be compiled into something we call a MUF file, so managed object format. Yeah. I'm going to skip the details a bit, but think of this for the devs in the room. This is your C# code, your MUF file is your DLL, pretty much. And the DLL is what you send over. Just probably a bad analogy, but just bear with me. So this here, what I'm going to be doing is at the end of this, I'm going to be calling, so see this demo2 here, I'm calling it as if it was a method. That is actually the name of my configuration. Okay. So I'm going to go in and execute this script. Demo 2, run this. It's going to prompt me for my credentials. So I pass in farm credentials or the install credentials. And it generated that localhost.muff. So my configuration is valid. It got compiled. Now what I want to do is I want to go in and do start DSC configuration with demo 2. So I'm basically telling the LCM, go ahead and execute that configuration on the server. By default, that command is going to be asynchronous. So if I run this, it's going to say, I started a background thread. I'm not going to tell you when it's done. So what you need to do is use the actual wait switch, and I'm going to use verbose just for the demo purpose. So I run this. It's going to go in. It should take about 10 seconds. Just going, all right, so that managed path doesn't already exist. I'm going to create it. That second one doesn't exist. I'll create it. Come on. It's at 10 seconds. So then it's done. If I go back in here and refresh this, I should see my managed path now assigned to that web application. There you go, videos and archives. Now, what's interesting as well is because I'm now, my environment has been onboarded onto DSC, is I can do some type of reporting. So I can go in and do, all right, test DSC configuration. So basically asking the question, is this box configured the way it should be? And no surprises there. It's going to take a few seconds and come back with true. Yes, it's in the desired state. Now, what happens if Bob goes back in and decides to delete the archive? It's going to go in, delete the selected path, off we go. We all agree we're no longer in the desired state. I rerun this. Again, no surprises. This is going to come back with false. But that doesn't give me much information. So with PowerShell 5 and above, what we introduced is a switch called the detailed switch. And that's going to provide us that's going to give us back a bit more insights into what's actually happening behind the scene. So it's going to come back and say, your server's not in the desired state. However, the video managed path is, but the archive managed path is not. Right? So that's kind of additional reporting that we have. Now, what's going to happen in the case where I said, all right, you know what? If you detect a configuration drift, I want you to automatically fix them whenever you find them. It's going to go in the background. I'm not going to wait 15 minutes. But trust me, this is what would happen in the background within 15 minutes. It's going to go back and just call into the start DSC configuration switch, this time using the use existing, basically telling it, I've detected a configuration drift. Just please reapply what the desired state should be. I'm going to run this. It started a background job because I didn't put the wait switch. And then within a second or two, I should see my, my managed path back. Videos. Come on. There we go, archives. Whew. All right, demo gods are with me today. All right, let's quickly flip back to this here. So Brian mentioned that DSC, unfortunately, and I have to agree, has a learning curve. To get started with this, if you're used traditional PowerShell, you're not going to get started within the first hour, right? You need to understand how the modules work, how the different pieces like the LCM work, and so on. So what we came up with is something called reverse DSC. It's something that, I mean, it was something people have been asking for in AutoSPInstaller, right, Brian, as well? Being able to extract configuration out of an existing environment. So this is what we built in. What it is basically, if you have any existing SharePoint environment, you go in, you install that module. So the command to install it is there, install script, SharePoint DSC.reverse. It will download that module from the PowerShell gallery, assuming you have internet connectivity. If you don't, run it from a machine that does, and you simply copy that module folder over to the SharePoint box. And what it does is it gives you that option to extract the configuration out of your existing environment. Reverse DSC is not something that's specific to SharePoint. We have reverse DSC for IIS, for SQL Server, for AD, and we have one for SharePoint. I'm going to be honest, the one we have for SharePoint is probably the more mature one. Right? The other ones, they work, but they don't have full feature parity with the actual DSC modules. So some scenarios that this opens the door to is recreating environments. That one's fairly easy, right? I can't tell you how many customers I go to that don't have a dev environment. Or they have a dev environment and they're going, yeah, we're not using that because it's so out of sync with production. So the idea is run that, extract your production, replicate it in dev. for example, right? That's one option. Or doing disaster recovery, high availability, recreating that environment. Full fidelity extraction, full fidelity recreation. Yeah. Onboarding existing environment. That's actually a scenario we didn't foresee in the beginning. So this is the idea where you built your SharePoint farm currently using whatever scripts you found on the web or AutoSPInstaller, but you want to get the monitoring features that DSC brings. You don't have that because it was not built originally with DSC. So this idea is extract your environment using reverse DSC. So you ask the question, tell me how you're currently configured. The moment you obtain that script, you push it right back and you go, by the way, your current configuration has officially become your desired configuration, and from now on, anything that drifts, you report. So that's one scenario we support as well. Point-in-time snapshots. Have customers that do reverse DSCs every month, and then they'll do deltas, right? They'll open it in like WinMerge or Notepad++, and they'll see, all right, what changed in the past month? That's perfectly fine. Keeping environments in sync. That's one of the big ones. We're going to do a demo of that in Office 365 later on, with reverse DSC. So am I up to demo? Yes, let's go back to the demos. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to flip back to Brian's environment, the one where he actually created his search service application. So if we refresh this here, go back in there. So that's done. So everything got created properly. The search service application is in there. If I refresh this, there it is, right here. What I want to do is I want to go and I want to extract that configuration as a DSC and replicate it somewhere else. So it was created with AutoSPInstaller. I'm going to be pulling it out as DSC. One thing I want to do, the first thing is I'm going to go and install that script. So install script, and I have a typo right there. I probably have it in memory somewhere. Install script, SharePoint DSC.reverse. I force this. That machine is going to go ping the PowerShell gallery, download all the various components that make the reverse DSC for SharePoint. Should take about 20 seconds. And once that's done, I'm going to go and execute that script. Look, we are looking at converting that to a module. It should have been a module from the get-go. Right now, it is a script. But what we introduced last fall, if you folks have played with reverse DSC before, is a user interface to allow people to go and select exactly what they want to extract. Instead of having it a all or nothing type of solution, the moment you're going to be executing that script, whenever the VM decides to wake up, I'm going to execute that script, and you're going to see an actual GUI pop up with checkboxes where you can go and decide what you want to extract. So I'm going to run this. It's going to come back with all the workloads that we support. I'm going to zoom in on this just a little bit for the folks at the back. But basically, there we go. So everything that we support in the SharePoint DSC, so everything that can be done in central admin is in there. I can go and decide, all right, I want to extract a specific service application or all of them. In my case, what I want to do is I'm going to go and do onSelect all, and I'm simply going to go in and select, all right, I want the search service application, the index partition, and the topology. Right, that's all I want. I'm going to go in, put in my farm, my installer account. That looks good. I'm going to run this, and reverse DSC is going to go crazy and do its job. So it's currently pulling only what I specified. Now, if you wanted to do a full unattended extract, the very first line that we're going to be that's going to come back when you run reverse DSC is the equivalent unattended install. So if you want to do an unattended extract without the UI, you can just copy and paste that line there, just in case people are wondering. That's it, so it's done. It extracted the search service application, so I'm going to go and provide it a path. I'm going to go C extracted. So if the folder doesn't exist, it creates it. And now look at what I have here. So if I open this up, I will have, let me zoom in for the folks at the back. What I have is, actually down here, is the exact search service application that Brian deployed with AutoSPInstaller with his XML as DSC. So I can take that, either push it right back on the current server that Brian configured, or I can replicate it somewhere else. Okay. So this is what reverse DSC is in a nutshell. How are we doing for time?
Oh, hang on. About 20 minutes.
20 minutes? That's good.
23 minutes.
So let's go back to the slides real quick and talk about the new kid in town. So Office 365 desired state configuration. We currently support Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive,
Teams.
What?
Teams.
Teams, yes, sorry. Teams, and everything that has to do with like security and compliance. So we have some modules in there as well. We will introduce support for other workloads like the Yammer, Flow, Power Apps, and so on. It's not there as of today, but we do support everything that has to do with OneDrive SharePoint. If you want to go and try it, you run install module Office 365 DSC, just like what I showed you there with the reverse DSC. We'll go download the bits and install them on your computer. The one thing it does that is actually pretty awesome is right now, if you want to do PowerShell to manage your Office 365 tenant, you need the Microsoft Teams PowerShell module to manage Teams. To manage users, you need the MSOL service or the Azure AD module. For SharePoint, you need the SharePoint Online Management Shell and maybe the PNP. And then on top of that, what you need for, anyway, so you need so many different libraries. Once you run this command there, the install Office 365 DSC, we install everything by default, right? Because some of our resources are actually built on top of PNP. Some of them are built on top of the Microsoft Teams. So we're not reinventing the wheel. We're just exposing those components as DSC resources. Now, what we support currently, we support creation and monitoring of cycle collections, teams and channels. We're going to do a couple of demos, Office 365 groups, and user licenses. Right, so you can make sure that users actually have the right license assigned to them. You can use reverse DSC, which, by the way, is baked in Office 365 DSC to get a list of all your users and figure out what licenses are being assigned. Right? Natively, you don't need to go and learn what the common lets are. Configure multiple tenants the exact same way. That's something we don't have right now. So what I'm going to be demoing later on is I'm going to be extracting configuration out of one of my tenants and replicating it over a trial tenant I created this morning, configuration-wise. And then the last one, of course, the integration between the configuration and Azure DevOps. Right? So this idea, and this here is a mind shift in a certain way. Right? For IT admins that are doing anything that has to do with configuration as code. You folks are now writing code, just like the devs. Right? So it's important to get on board with the application lifecycle management. Right? I'm not saying you should install Visual Studio full-fledged on your computer, but you're producing code. So it's important that it's managed and integrated with the CI/CD DevOps pipeline. We're going to be talking about that later on.
Bit of a spoiler, Nick mentioned the ability to replicate changes and to keep multiple tenants in sync. Can anyone think of where this would be useful? Test, production, dev, exactly. Oop, what happened? Clicker. Yeah, exactly. The ALM for Office 365 is one of the biggest questions that I get on an ongoing basis from customers is like, okay, well, how do we do ALM properly with SharePoint development in Office 365 and SharePoint Online? Like, how does this work? And this, at least partially right now, is an answer to that because it enables us to keep our production tenant and all of its configuration settings, all of the user accounts, all of that stuff in sync with other tenants, either on a complete basis or just bit by bit. And really, it's going to be a huge bonus and a huge helpful tool in keeping those syncs, those environments in sync, and thus helping with our O365 ALM. Yes.
So just before, I'm just going to ask you if you can fix the deck. So
Oh,
I don't
sorry.
know what
Okay.
happened there. Yes, question. So what's the strategy to keeping up with the changes in Office 365?
Drinking from
That
the fire
is the
hose.
million-dollar question. No. So basically, I mean, we all work as part of the same team, right, in a certain way. So for example, the Microsoft Teams folks released the official Microsoft Teams module that's a month ago. Before then, we were using version 0.96, I think. They released one, and there were plenty of changes. Well, we got a heads up before, right? So the way we're actually handling it internally, if you look at the module, it's worth doing a quick demo for this. So if I go in, this one here. Let me just open my folder real quick. I'm just gonna hide this for 1 second because I've got so much secret stuff that I don't want you guys to see. But I'm gonna go in and just show you what the module definition is. Okay, almost there. Sorry, bear with me, folks, but this is actually a pretty good question. So if I go back here, in our module definition, when we specify the dependencies, we specify what version we're using. Right? So this is the beauty about DSCs, you can have side by side. So if the Teams folk decide to release module 1.1 tomorrow, and all the command lists we're using are not there anymore, well, that version 1 is still going to be available. So our stuff is still going to work. Right? I mean, it's not going to be breaking. You can install module 1.1 with module 1. Our stuff will use the old one. The API, we have some contracts, right, with the PG as well. So I mean, it's still going to work. Okay? But that's a great question. So what I want to do next is I want to go in and show you just a quick example of how it would work for Office 365 DSC. Office 365, as I said, supports various workloads. The demo we're going to do here, as you folks can see, is we're going to be creating a team and a channel. That team is going to be called BRK169, which, by the way, is the hashtag for this session. And we're going to be creating a user feedback channel. So just like my normal on-premises DSC stuff, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to switch over to an official PowerShell console here. I'm going to go in and actually, you know what? No, let's do it from here. I'm going to go and compile this, so execute this script. Why? I want F5. All right, so I'm going to go in. I'm going to execute this. It's going to prompt me for my credentials. Just bear with me while I type them in. So that is admin at this here. So assuming I didn't do any typos, I'm going to go in here, do cd demo 4. All right, so here, so I have my demo 4 of PS1. It compiled into my tenant configuration. I'm going to go in and do start DSC configuration, my tenant, wait, and verbose. And before that, because I believe in showing you that there's no smoke and mirrors in my demo, what I have here is my admin center. So my teams right now for this tenant, my demo tenant that I'm going to be using, has no teams created whatsoever. I mean, I'm going to refresh just to show you, but it's brand new. I created it actually yesterday afternoon, but E5 trial without any modification whatsoever. Okay? So I'm going to go back in my PowerShell console, run this. If the demo gods are with me and I didn't do any typos, creating teams, that looks good. So at the back, there you go. So you see that appearing at the back there? So this is my tenant right now that's being monitored there. If I was to go and delete a channel, run test DSC configuration, it'll come back and say, no, your tenant is not in the desired state. Now, I've installed the Office 365 module before on this machine. By default, you get a new command called export O365 configuration. Run this, similar to what we had previously. So those are the workloads we support, the various components we can extract. I'm going to be honest with you. This demo I tricked a little because I unchecked some of the stuff because I know they take too long to extract. So I'm not going to bother with those. But let me show you this here. So I'm going to go and type in the credentials. So it has to be global admin account, by the way. So I'm going to go admin O365 DSC. All right, so this is my personal demo tenant. I've created some teams in there, I have some side collections and so on. So I'm going to go and extract this. This will take about, let's say, a good minute. Right? But what I'm going to do after this is I'm going to show you that with that extraction, I probably mistyped something. Admin at, yes. Okay. All right, so it's extracting my users, it's extracting my side collections and so on, so we're going to see it live. But with that, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to take that configuration, I'm going to change the tenant name in one place, right? Because there's actually, when you do an extraction, oh, what did I do wrong? Let me try this again. I'm going to go here, rerun this. There we go. Admin at O365 DSC. Sorry about this. Right. But what it's going to generate when I finish the export is going to generate two files. One PS1 file, which is really the skeleton of what my tenant is. So all the users, all the configuration, basically the search service, search managed properties, and so on. And then it's going to generate a second file called a PSD1 file. That one is the configuration data. And that one, in one line, it will say what domain it was extracted from. So I can just go and modify that PSD1 file and replicate it over another tenant. I'm going to show you that example, but just so you know, it's super easy. It's going to be actually 2 lines. Central admin URL I need to change, and the domain name. But that's going to take everything you're seeing here, extracted from one tenant, replicating it over the other. Now, one question I'm going to get asked at the end if I don't answer it right now is, where does a PnP provisioning engine fit into this? Well, we don't really overlap, right? Because PnP engine, like, they'll let you create some teams. So that's probably one overlap point that we have. But they deal more with the artifacts, if you want. They don't deal with content, but they'll recreate lists, they'll recreate content types. We don't do this. We do SharePoint admin, right? So whatever you have in the admin, recreating the components, we take care of that. We don't recreate lists and content types, for example. Okay. So we're at the teams now. Should take just one last second. So just like the reverse DSC for SharePoint, when it's done, it's going to ask me where I want to save it. Yes, question? Does it work with modern auth? And then this is where I flip over. So you mean MFA?
Yes. Are you sure? Did you plan this? Yeah.
But just 1 second. So do you mean?
Yes. Yeah. So basically, the big part of that looks after that is actually an external module, which is in preview right now, which is called MS Cloud Login Assistant, and I mentioned that in one of my first slides. So that's a module that I've been working on that sort of helps to automate the login to various O365 services. One of the things that it can do is if it detects, if you try to connect with legacy auth and it fails, instead of giving you a nasty error message back, it's just going to say, okay, well, that failed. I'm going to gracefully fail in the background, and then I'm going to prompt the user with a nice web login box. And before we even do that, we basically collect a Windows credential. And the annoying thing about the various Office 365 services, if you will, is that they authenticate, and the interface has been historically a little bit different in each one. A couple of them now support the ability to pre-populate the username. So it's a little bit less typing. Anyhow, long and the short of it is, as this evolves and as this gets better, it already is part of Office 365 DSC, but it's going to be, you're going to see more and more automation. Quick answer to your question is yes, it will support MFA.
Well, actually,
will and does.
Yeah.
Like it does.
Right. So I'm done. It prompted me where I wanted to save the extract. I specified DSC O365. I've got my 2 files. So if I open my PS1 here, I'm going to see things like, all right, so my users, so we saw like Torsten, what he currently is assigned the developer pack license, and so on. But one thing you're never going to see in this PS1 is my domain. That was extracted out of o365dsc.onmicrosoft.com. Nowhere in there do I see that domain. That is actually part of my PSD1 file. So PSD1 file is really the variables for that environment. And you see in that non-node data section, I have the organization name and the central admin URL. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and replace this by the trial tenant I created yesterday. So 1, 2, save this. And then if I go in and compile this file, so cd dsco, there we go. I'm going to go and compile my PS1. It's going to prompt me for my global tenant account, admin at. Now, what I'm putting in is actually the destination tenant. Let's do this. It's going to compile it, and now I can just go and do start, DSC configuration, setter, start. Okay, O365 tenant config, wait, verbose. And I'll let it run. I'll come back to it and I'll show you that I have additional teams that are going to be created there. I think I had a SharePoint Saturday Montreal. I had a SharePoint Conference 2019. I currently don't have any site collections other than the default ones that get created when you spin off your tenant. So we're going to see a couple of additional site collections being created as well. But again, Brand new tenant, existing one, extract configuration, replicate over, configuration-wise. I'm going to switch back to this using the mouse.
You're back to
All right, so basically this is what we've covered. So those examples are going to be in the slides as well. So when you do this, your team gets created, the command to run, the interface. And one thing I haven't covered is this here. So because what we have now is configuration as code, I can leverage something in Azure Automation called Azure Automation DSC. Right? Think of it almost as an orchestrator for all your DSC stuff. So if I go in, actually, I'm going to do a live demo for that one instead. I'm going to go back to this machine, and I'm going to switch virtual desktop. So there we go. So this is my internal Azure account. And what I've done here is I've actually defined a configuration. Sorry, let me show you this here first. I've defined a configuration for Office 365 that defines two users, so Nick and Brian, that creates two site collections, human resources and finances, and a team and channels. Right? So this is my configuration. I want this exact same configuration to be applied to my dev tenant, my QA tenant, and my configuration tenant. So what I do is I upload it to Azure Automation, and you need to compile it within Azure Automation. We're going to skip the details, but I compile it for my dev tenant, providing the global tenant account for dev, same thing for QA and prod. And then it goes in, and what it will do is it will do that consistency check for me. And then it will report any problems that I have with my environment. So I can go in here and say quickly, all right, you know what? Houston, we have a problem. I've got two compliance tenants, so I see that my prod and QA are compliant, but not my dev. So somebody must have been playing with the dev tenant and did a configuration drift somehow. So I want to go in and investigate what's going on. So I'll go in, I'll open my dev thing, and we see that the last consistency check came back with non-compliant, not compliant. I click in there, I want to get more information. And here it's going to go, all right, so the current configuration for that tenant has different building blocks. It deals with users, site, teams, those are all good. But there's a problem with one of your channels. I'm going to go in here, click on this, and it's going to come back and say, yeah, so your configuration defined two teams channels. So one called the leadership team, so LT, and one called the alpha team. Well, there's a problem with the alpha team. It was deleted, right? So it's not compliant. So it's just a matter of reapplying. I can reapply it from here, or if I configured my, my machine, my LCM to be applying autocorrect, it will automatically go and fix it. But you have all the monitoring that's part of this. So you're monitoring your Office 365 tenants from within Azure, which is pretty cool. By the way, Azure configuration is free if you're already using Azure. So that part that does the monitoring, you're not paying for anything there. OK, moving on now. Let's go back here for one sec. Any questions on what we've covered so far? We're good?
We have about 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's good. And you know what? This is really the last thing. But again, I'm going at various conferences, open source conferences, and I do sessions that are non-Microsoft like related, right? I'll just talk about technology on anything. And one of the things I'm trying to preach is for the IT pros to get involved with the application lifecycle management as much as possible, right? Now that we have configuration as code, even in Azure, you can define your hardware as ARM templates. That's all code, right? So I can say, all right, so I have examples actually that will deploy an entire SharePoint farm, all the servers, all the disk, all the network interfaces and all, and then apply DSC for the configuration on it. Everything is as code, managed within Azure DevOps through automated pipelines. I want to add a new disk to my SharePoint server. I write 5 lines of code, save it back to my DevOps. It's going to automatically add a disk to my dev farm, for example. Right? So it's really important, and the power behind it is just amazing. What I'm going to be doing is, you guys are probably getting tired of me flipping back and forth, but the last thing I want to show you is this here. So I have an Azure DevOps project in which I manage my Office 365 configuration. So if I go in here, I have an Office 365 file, and that file defines 2 site collections, or actually probably more than that. Yeah, okay, so 2 site collections, 1 team and 1 channel. So let's say I get a request. So I'm the IT department or the admins taking care of this tenant. I get a request saying I need to create a new channel for the DevOps demo channel team. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in. I would do that in Visual Studio normally, but just for demo's sake, I'm just going to go in, do this. All right, I'm going to call this, let's say, DSC channel 2. I'm going to go and call it DevOps demo Nick. I commit this. So I've added a new channel. I saved it in my Azure Automation account. Because I have continuous integration enabled in there, it's automatically going to detect that I have changes. It's going to trigger a new build. That build is going to take about 30 seconds, let's say, to finish. So what it's doing is running some tests against my configuration, making sure it's valid, copying the files as an artifact. And then the other thing I have after this is a release pipeline. I'm not going to bore you folks with the details, but what I want you to understand is with this here, the process is I made a modification in code. Automatically, the build agent in Azure DevOps is going to take that change, push it to my dev tenant without me doing anything. I just saved the code. Continuous integration, pushes it to my dev tenant. Whoever's in charge of the dev testing is going to get an email saying, all right, the change you requested is in the dev tenants. Do you approve it? Yes, approve it from email. Poof, that automatically gets moved over to the QA tenant. Do you approve it? Yes, boom, automatically goes to prod. Right? All this by adding 5 lines of code to my configuration. The same applies to on-premise as well. The moment you can express your configuration as code, you can integrate that directly with your build pipelines. So if I refresh this here, where's my build at? So the build is finished. I should see new release. There we go. So I have a new release now, deploying to stage 1. I'm going to go take a look at this. And what we're going to see is my DSC execution in this console here. It's going to go load my module, download Office 365, DSC, and so on, and it's going to go in the build agent. It's going to push that to my dev environment. That is really all I had as far as material. Question?
Just to clarify, are you the continuous integration you can use Azure DevOps to deploy the changes to on-prem? Is that
Oh yeah, big time. Absolutely. Well, given you have some connectivity, right?
And just to really loop back on the initial part of this, which seems kind of the initial phase of this presentation, which seems a little bit far off because we've covered so much stuff in these 60 minutes. But what I used to tell customers when they were using AutoSPInstaller and they asked me, okay, so where's our build book? I said, well, this is your build book, right? The XML file in combination with the scripts, in combination with your binaries, that is what's going to get you a new environment. You want to make a new environment with a different name. You want to build a DR environment. You want to build a dev environment. Take those same building blocks, make a couple of changes to them, and then boom, you got to replicate something. And then this is going on 10 years now, where I've been doing this kind of thing. And this is the next big thing. This is the evolution of that concept. Configuration is code. Your hardware is in source control, right? Like, think about it. You can build yourself VMs just by respinning this, rerunning these commands. This defines your hardware. This defines your infrastructure, right? When it's all virtualized and it's living in Azure or living in some other, virtualized environment, this is really where DevOps, IT pros put on their dev caps at least part-time, because it really does save you a lot of time and a lot of effort. And
just to wrap this up, we've all seen some red text in there. So the problem was I forgot. So if we take a look at my SP site here, because I edited the file directly in Azure DevOps, I didn't get the IntelliSense I would normally get within Visual Studio. But Visual Studio would have told me you're missing a mandatory property on your site collection, which is template. So I didn't have that in there. So that's my bad. Sorry, but trust me, it works. Trust me. And yeah, that is really all we had. As you said, we covered so much stuff in 60 minutes. We have a bunch of videos available online. Please go to the GitHub repository. Okay. I was mentioning a GitHub repo where I'm going to be putting all the demos at the beginning. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to be putting that link in the deck, and that deck is going to be on the conference site. Okay, so you're going to get access to all. I'm going to add a resource slide with a bunch of articles that talk about the DSC, because we're missing that actually, and upload that in the conference on the conference site for you folks to consume. Okay.
Yeah. In addition, I made reference to a blog post earlier on. I didn't really show the blog post, but there's a link to that in the deck as well, in addition to the actual, the 3 or 4 steps that I ran, if you're interested in doing those single configuration changes with AutoSPInstaller still.
And on that note, it's 3 o'clock, so I hope you folks get to enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.